For years I'm going, coming back, turning around the mountain, getting up in the middle of the night to make sure it is still there, staring at it, walking all over it, and dreaming.
Etel Adnan wrote these lines in 1986 in a poetic essay about Mount Tamalpais, a peak in Marin County, California, that could be seen from the window of her home in Sausalito. Mount Tam, as many would come to call the peak, would take a more prominent role in her paintings when she returned to the United States from Beirut in the 1990s. At times, it would appear softly amidst the Bay Area fog, and at other times, it would announce itself boldly on the canvas. For Adnan, this mountain was more than an empty backdrop, but would become an anchor that would infuse her writing and her paintings. Adnan's return to the mountain was kaleidoscopic, revealing an ongoing figure of manifestation. For Adnan, and for others who would encounter her paintings, Mount Tam carried a cosmic and divine mode of attuning oneself to the world that would carry through all of her works. Later, as a graduate student at UC Berkeley, I too would journey to Mount Tamalpais, making my way towards her, finding her light at sunrise, gazing out my window to make sure she was still there at a distance, or ending my day at the Berkeley Marina watching the sun set across the water with Mount Tam peeking out from the misty skies. Mount Tam was a centrifugal force. To me, like for Adnan, she became a pole that carried memories, dreams, melancholy, and marvel. In Journey to Mount Tamalpais, Adnan writes that, quote, "The pyramidal shape of the mountain reveals a perfect intelligence within the universe. Sometimes its power to melt in mist reveals the infinite possibilities for matter to change its appearance." End quote. And so, let us journey once more as we explore the work that Etel Adnan has left us, beginning with her memories of the mountain. Welcome back to Tomorrow is the Problem, an ICA Miami Art and Research Center podcast. I'm your host, Donna Honarpiche. In this episode, through the work of artist and poet Etel Adnan, we will voyage beyond the tops of mountains into the cosmic realm as we find out how repetition and rituals might open up new ways of seeing and imagining.
I met her more than 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, when I first came to the Bay Area.
This is Stefania Pandolfo. She's a professor of anthropology at UC Berkeley who has decades of experience conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the Maghreb and whose research lies at the intersection of Islamic cosmologies, aesthetics, and psychoanalysis. As a PhD student at Berkeley, I was lucky enough to take her courses, and together we also went on long walks where we could see Mount Tam in the distance. She was also a dear friend of poet and writer Etel Adnan.
She was living with Simone Fatal, her companion, lifelong companion and partner in Sausalito in their house. It was a little house at the edge of the hill that could see both the bay and Mount Tamalpais. And it was a house full of her paintings. They were everywhere and very simple house. It was an extraordinarily kind of modest, and it's a place for thinking and for meditating and for creating. While at the same time, it was also the place where one could share anguish and fear and anger about things that were happening in the world.
Etel Adnan was attuned to the anguish of the world around her. She was born in Beirut to a Greek mother and a Syrian father. It was 1925, right in the wake of the Ottoman Empire's collapse and the installation of the French Mandate in Lebanon. And after being educated in French schools, she felt caught between cultures and languages from an early age.
we started sharing a lot of kind of also personal dimensions of our life and our relationship, exiled relationship to both Europe and the Middle East.
Adnan attended La Sorbonne in Paris before moving to the United States to attend graduate school at Berkeley and Harvard. All the while, she was developing a poetic writing practice that would later catapult her to a global recognition. But the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence marked a change.
She chose not to write in French, right? Because she started being intolerant of the colonial echoes in the French language.
Troubled by the colonial hegemony of writing in the French language and in solidarity with the Algerian struggle against colonial rule, Adnan's writing took a new shape. As she began to explore the limits of language, she found an alternate form of expression in abstract painting.
In Etel, there is this relationship between writing and violence, which we find very much in the colonial and early post-colonial period. She says it's because poetry is in the social world. Language is shared, and language is related to a culture that is transmitted. And when the culture is both transmitted and interrupted, when war destroys the social world, where belonging becomes impossible, where families start murdering each other, then poetry becomes the site of witnessing that world. And so the poetry is painful. The poetry is animated by an urge to testify to this, and of course to transform it in the moment in which it is testified. But she sees her poetry as pain, as a kind of something written at the limit of what can be said. And she sees painting as a space of meditation and peace. And so that painting becomes almost an antidote, becomes an art cure, so to speak.
As she developed her painting practice, Adnan found a muse in a moment that she would later define as the most important encounter of her life. She found Mount Tamalpais.
It was my point of reference. It was like a pause. That when I saw it, I felt at home. It was un point de référence. It had something to do with a landmark that orients you, not physically, but emotionally also.
She created a circle of poets and artists who were learning how to perceive and went on walks around the mountain in order to sort of develop their antennas, as Etel calls them, their capacity to receive from the outside and perceiving this strong sense of perception.
Adnan became entranced by the 2,500-foot-tall peak that rose in sight of her home in Sausalito. She would return to this mountain over and over again, painting it from various angles and times of day, with varying levels of abstraction, and playing with a range of colors and almost always with a round sun hovering over it. But she was drawn not just to the visual beauty of Mount Tamalpais, but also the histories it carried within it, including the indigenous presences she perceived emanating from the mountain.
But it is also what she attempts to do, or she teaches us, how can I call it, a pedagogy, a method to be able to listen in this other way, to be able to relate to time in a kind of synchronous and not just diachronous way, in which it becomes possible to walk on the sides of Mount Tamalpais and actually experience the presence of that was gone. There was a sacred mountains for the Indians who lived there, who are still there for Etel, who have not just been there in the past, but are actively there, and who are borne witness by the life of the plants, by the life of the rocks, by the waves of the sea, the way it breaks on Stinson Beach, just at the bottom of Mount Tamalpais.
Adnan's relationship to the mountain as a symbol through which she explores the many facets of life, from dreams to nightmares, can be traced across her paintings as well as in her writing. Here's an excerpt from Adnan's book, Journey to Mount Tamalpais, read by Leila Riazi, a PhD candidate in UC Berkeley's Department of Comparative Literature, who is also a translator of Etel Adnan's work.
I always thought that dreaming was the honor of the human species. The logic of dreams is superior to the one we exercise while awake. In dreams, the mind at last finds its courage. It dares what we do not dare. It also creates, from nightmares to fantastic calculations, and it perceives reality beyond our fuzzy interpretations. In dreams, we swim and fly, and we are not surprised. For years, Tamalpay is speaking itself into dreams, telling about the past and the present, or rather, transcending any notion of ordinary time. One October night, I dreamed that the whole mountain was made of glass, a sick, greenish glass. The long and rusty streaks of kelp was in it. I was lying over it, looking in and discovering Indians telling me with sign language and impatient gestures that they were imprisoned for centuries. There was nothing I could do to liberate them, and a cold sweat awoke me. Dreams spill over on our days. For some people, they never stop spilling. The visionaries, the hobos, and all those who speak to themselves aloud in the big cities. In a room full of dreams, do not go. They will invade you and eat you. If you are a painter, go in. They will be friendly. And look at the night. It is a reservoir or black ink you can use on virgin paper.
Paper and ink were special to Adnan, not only as metaphor. Her encounter with the leporello, a style of accordion folding with printed material, would help bridge the gap between not only her writing and visual practices, but the linguistic and geographic gulfs established in her early life.
Through this text, which is this kind of folding poem, folding art book, in which Etel took the poetic work of some of her poets' friends in Lebanon, but also in Algeria, in Morocco. She was traveling through the Middle East, and she was in Syria, and she copied down as an amanuensis in this humble work of transcription, even though she does not write in Arabic. She has written in Arabic as a painter, in the Leporello Zikr, in which the name of God, Allah, is repeated endlessly through the page with superimposition of her own hands and other drawings in different colors, where colors sort of explode out of the page.
As she says, writing is drawing and drawing is writing.
This is Julian Myers-Zupinska, an art historian and co-editor of the book, The Ninth Page, Etel Adnan's Journalism from 1972 to 1974.
She was something of an émigré, not quite a refugee, but she had left Beirut, a city under colonial domination. She returned to Beirut in 1972, and she ended up being offered the job of culture editor at a small newspaper called Al Safa.
Adnan began writing political editorials, mapping out the fertile bohemian artistic culture in Beirut and critiquing politics in Lebanon and beyond.
She wrote an essay, for example, criticizing the Vietnam War and aerial bombing as a military strategy. She wrote an essay celebrating the overthrow of colonial government in Algeria. She wrote in a way that was extremely passionate and vivid and poetic. She took being the culture editor as the ability to write politically in a way that reflected her own lyrical sensibility.
Her time as a journalist in Beirut revealed the sheer breadth of Adnan's social and political commitments, as well as her skills in language.
I think that the journalistic writing and the poetry, they're written by the same person, and they embody the same voice and perspective on the world, but they're written for really different purposes. In the interview that I mentioned that we did for the catalog, she talked about her love of sports writing as being a place where description could kind of run wild and where people had to write often very, very quickly. And some sense of that, like sharpness, freshness, timeliness, and spontaneity does filter into the writing. In some way, if you lose that, the game is lost. And that speaks of somebody for whom making art and writing were a part of daily life.
While much of her work was grounded in the everyday, as she so aptly describes in her Dreams of the Mountain, Adnan was undeniably impacted by the extraordinary.
Some of the writing that happened before she returned to Beirut in 1972 was meditating on the miracle of the moon landing.
Beginning 30 hours of continuous coverage of the lunar landing.
She wrote a poem called 5 Senses for One Death that was absolutely thunderstruck at the Apollo mission.
It's one small step for man, giant leap for mankind.
And this sense of seeing the world from outside and from this ability to zoom out was just as much a part of her aesthetic and worldview as was the daily, for example. The ability to see the world as a kind of whole thing, objectively and separate. And this rocked her world, and that sense never really left.
But along with wonder came horror and destruction. The beginning of the Lebanese War of 1977 would force Adnan to leave Beirut once again.
She retreated to Paris and wrote one of her most famous books called Sit Marie Rose, which was banned in Lebanon. The book is an account of the beginnings of that war and the atrocities that were committed as part of it. And she basically felt unwelcome. She was a political dissident. And so she returned to the Bay Area. And so that's more or less how her career in journalism ended.
The first book that she gave me was Sit Marie Rose, which I taught then in my classes when I was teaching the anthropology of the Middle East.
This is Stefania Pandolfo, who we heard from earlier.
It was stripped of every sensationalism, was stripped of every kind of easy emotion. And there were descriptions with incredibly short sentences that were able to sort of reveal the question of the intricate relationships of violence, attachment, and distraction that she saw as sort of animating the Lebanese civil war at the time.
Adnan would remain preoccupied by conflict in the Middle East for the rest of her life. Her 1989 book-length poem, The Arab Apocalypse, would prove to be her most significant work. Like in her Leporellos, Adnan brought to full force the power of the written word and visual symbolism to this piece. Much like her paintings of Mount Tem, the image of the sun rose high in this masterpiece.
The sun is the protagonist of the Arab Apocalypse. She wanted to write a poem, a celebratory poem about the sun as giving life, but the war hijacked the poem and it became a poem about destruction.
Adnan references 3 massacres throughout the Arab Apocalypse: the Karatina massacre in the Muslim district of Beirut in 1976, the massacre of the Palestinian camp of Taza in 1978, and the Sabra and Shatila massacre of 1982.
What kind of poem to the sun can be written if one has to also mourn the dead, if one is also seeing how the sun will burn us, how the sun incinerates, how the sun is both life and death, how the sun gives life and takes life, and how the sun is both murder and birth. In the book, she writes, "The radio says history with a capital H allocated 10 billion years to the sun.
In the physical text of the Arab apocalypse, Adnan drew many small, almost hieroglyphic symbols throughout the poem. Included in them was a sun made of a circle and 7 lines. These images were not entirely meant to be decoded, but to call on the reader to question what happens to language, to meaning, to our signs, in a world plagued by destruction. She writes,
"The sun written in capital letters has already lived half its age. Morning sun, evening sun. You are pure, you are pure." The sun insinuated itself into glycerin bags. The sun exploded. The sun emptied the drugstore. The sun is out for a walk in the desert. The sun takes drugs to commit its crimes on the hills. It takes drugs. The sun has ripped skins, bellies, feet, and brains, and the trees. Even the grains of sand exploded. Beirut capsized into the sun's heart, its spell annihilated. It came with the sun instead of a face. Sun hung on a tree in decapitated columns. Cried Babylon, woman got slaughtered. History has pushed the accelerator of its power to infinity.
We see in this excerpt that for Adnan, the cosmos and the site of a massacre are separated neither by time nor space. Apocalypse works across temporalities and at all scales, but even more, apocalypse, as the artist Jalal Tawfiq wrote about in reference to Adnan's work, becomes a revelation, a way of seeing the world.
So what does it mean to be at the same time capable of witnessing those histories, but also gain a lucidity, an ethical lucidity, and a political lucidity in relation to the larger frames within those histories are played, a history of the cosmos, which is also a history of oil in the Middle East, right?
Perhaps most importantly, the Arab apocalypse challenges our understanding of what it means to perceive.
Even though the Arab apocalypse is written in English and in French, and there is this other language that is part of it and that we don't pay attention to because we read it as simply part of a literary tradition, the question of vision, because it's clear that for Etel, like the image is not a representation, but the image is actually an act of witnessing, that it has to do with a way of relating to imagination, not just as an organ, which is an organ of our capacity to see and then remember and then mobilizing images that are part of our stored archive of a visual memory. This is a quote from Journeys on page 37 in the new edition. "Vision is the fainting of the eye on the object. Perception is the laser beam which destroys in order to assimilate. It is an exchange of energies."
So let us return, as Adnan always did, to the mountain. Amidst her reckoning with apocalypse, rebirth, and the cosmos, Adnan was grounded in the rituals of her art-making practice. Here's Meyer Supinska again.
So in the 1970s, Etel Adnan turned to a kind of painted repetition, a daily practice of painting the mountain. If she didn't have something else to paint, she would paint that. And so there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of paintings of Mount Tamalpais. Adnan largely worked, whether making writing or making art, at the same place, that is her desk. This repetition and dailiness is part of an everyday life in the way that doing morning ablutions would be. It's the condition and the form of her relationship to the world. Mountains exist in a kind of geological time. They're artifacts of forces and a time scale that are entirely not of human lives or even centuries or millennia. They exist beyond us. They existed before us. They will exist after us. They are not for us, but we can attune ourselves to them. And similarly, if you think about the importance of the Apollo mission, just this ability to exit the world.
Man is about to land on the moon.
One of the things that she paints, she says if she can't think of anything to paint, she'll paint this, is a red square. And the red square might stand for the sun. It might be a flag. It might just be a shape. And that this becomes a kind of symbol for this fixation, otherness, difference from the world that nevertheless is realized through this daily practice of making and writing.
While she had been pondering her place in the world through paintings and poetry for decades, Adnan's place in the mainstream art world would not come to full fruition until later in her life.
There's a moment of misrecognition that happens with her adoption in 2011-12 by the art world. This then speaks to a kind of problem, which is the narrative of discovery.
I think one problem with the discovery narrative is that it's problematic because it's like historically loaded word.
This is Naz Jagolu. She's a curator at the Asian Art Museum's Contemporary Art Department in San Francisco and an art writer from Istanbul. She wrote her thesis on Etel Adnan as a case study of the discovery narrative in curatorial practices.
So whenever we talk about an artist like Adnan, for example, when you read about her in the press, there is always this statement like overlooked, forgotten, like rediscovered artist. And I think it's really interesting, like there is this recurring language around their practices. And I realized like this creates a kind of myth around their practice as well. It's like they just kind of emerged in the space, like in a moment, without any reason. And that like they didn't have any history before that moment. So like when we use the word discovery, I think we should be aware of it. What are we really doing and what are we stepping into and what's our role in that? But also when we use the discovery and celebrate it, there is also a problem with that because we are not really acknowledging the structures that created that kind of celebration of discovery language in the first place.
Adnan's cosmic approach to art making troubles the conventional art historical categories mirrored by curatorial agendas.
This orientalization of practices of artists, quote unquote, from Middle East, and this kind of fetishization of pain, that kind of box that we put them into, what does it really mean? And I think that's why like Western art world have a problem with someone like Etel Adnan, because they cannot really fetishize her pain. Because she's talking about something much more bigger. She's talking about cosmos. She's talking about nature. She is beyond borders of time and space. And that's just who she is. And we have to deal with it. We do not have a holistic enough curatorial approach to hold someone like Etel Adnan at our institutions, who is beyond boundaries, like in terms of times, in terms of geographies.
Yeah, and I also think that there is such a subtle critique that she's making by returning to this mountain and painting it from all of these different orientations. It troubles and complicates her own position, as constantly changing. Yes. So she is not a static figure, and the art world cannot narrate her or position her as one. She's showing that movement and constantly undermining the authority of a singular position or a singular way of seeing through the work. And I think tying that to the political and historical underpinnings would generate more conversation and broaden the way we think about her, and also trouble this very, singular narrative that art historical categories and institutions tend towards.
Like in the case of Etel Adnan, for example, they showed her landscape paintings at the galleries. The reason was that it just has more value in the art market. I mean, this is also kind of a practical decision in terms of scale, because she's working in her studio and smaller sized paintings are just easier to work on. But at the same time, they are easier to move around when you travel. Because she's in California at that moment, like she will move to Beirut later. So like we can imagine her thinking that maybe she will go one day. Like I can also relate with this kind of having your luggage always at the door, because you are here, but your feet is always like at the door and you'll never know when you'll go back. And home doesn't really exist in a way, but home is also everywhere. So I think that kind of scale, like working on large scale, is a privilege. And someone like Etel Adnan, who is an immigrant here, she did not have that privilege to work on that scale.
Etel Adnan's death in 2021 lent a new importance to the question of her legacy. Like her exploration of apocalypse and the cosmos, her complexity as a person and an artist will continue to open up new space and ways of thinking. Join us next time in our final episode of the season, where we'll explore the works of contemporary artist Lucy Bull alongside the psychedelic countercultures of the 60s and the blurry borders between art and trance. Tomorrow is the Problem is produced in partnership with Podfly Productions. This episode was written and produced by Aubrey Calloway and me, Donna Honarpiche. Our executive producer is Jocelyn Aram. Our recording engineer is Carle Reem Neal. Our sound designer is Nina Pollock. Special thanks to Stefania Pandolfo, Julian Myers-Supinska, and Naz Kujolu for joining us on the show. And thank you to Leila Riazi for reading Etel Adnan's poems. You can read Riazi's translation of Etel Adnan's 1973 short story, L'Œil Noir, in the spring issue of the Los Angeles Review of Books Quarterly. I'm Donna Honarpiche. Thank you for listening.